Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, everybody. If you're in our live audience, you were just hearing Let There Be Peace from Sweet Honey in the Rock. And I'm playing that in honor of our new ancestor, Bernice Reagan Johnson, who passed away this summer, but left such a legacy of love and freedom and justice on our hearts. Y'all, it is season 5 of Centering Justice, hosted by Nonprofit Enterprise at Work and myself. My name is Yodit Mesfin Johnson. I'm the president and CEO here and the host of Centering Justice. At New, we are on a mission to inspire and equip nonprofit organizations, leaders, social change makers, businesses with the tools and resources and the space, the physical space they need to advance their powerful missions, all while fostering a collective vision of a just and thriving society. And bear with me because you might see a handsome face on the screen with me, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. But if you are new to Centering Justice, this is a space for us to explore pathways to justice, to freedom, and to joy. It's also a space for us to turn our attention towards the upstream and external forces that impact our work and that really impact our ability to transform the conditions of our community and communities, not just to service them. I hope that makes sense. So we are incentivized to work downstream as nonprofits, and we at New believe that we can support the sector in looking at and attending to those external forces that impact us, everything from philanthropy to, of course, politics to what's happening more locally in our communities. And it's my hope that each episode will deepen our understanding of the practice of racial justice as a way for all of us to get free, not just some of us. We'll interrogate how we can dismantle oppressive thinking, the cop in our minds, as well as the systems that we're interacting with, and how we move towards self-liberation and the liberation of all of our people together. So we are here to simultaneously break the bad while we build the new. And if you tuned in, no matter who you are, where you work, where you come from, know that this podcast is for you. I got to give a special shout out to our showrunner, Jess Carmichael, who is instrumental in engineering each episode and keeping us on track. Thank you, Jess. So episode 5, if you count back, means that we started Centering Justice in 2020. And for the first time since then, we are devoting an entire season to one topic, and it's a juicy one: deep democracy. And listen, this Pisces is feeling all the feels, okay? That's why we talk about deep democracy, because whether it's the election chaos or the DEI rollbacks that I fear are going to directly impact our work at New, but also the thousands of people and organizations that we work with every year, to the divisions in movements for liberation and justice, to even interpersonal conflicts. We had a number of those here over the last year, and I'm seeing them in a number of other formations and spaces that I belong to. My nervous system is fully activated. I can feel my trauma responses. I feel the fear. I feel that freeze. I feel even fawn. And y'all, I'm just coming back from 2 months off on a sabbatical, which, by the way, was fantastic, but it was hard to fully be present there when my people here and across the globe are hurting. And so, never the one to kind of sit on my laurels. I am doing the things I need to do to care for myself, and I want us all to be doing that. So I am getting out in nature. I'm resting. I'm breathing my way through this, and I'm conceiving of this season of centering justice as a space for all of us to explore new ways of being in relationship with each other, with our work, and to expand our thinking on some practical ways in which we can move through this present moment and future moments together. And I found the language and the conceptual framework in deep democracy. And I want to be real and say I am not an expert in deep democracy. I'm learning, and I'm inviting you on this learning journey with me and a friend and comrade, Ryan Henyard, who is going to be my guest host for the entire season. Ryan, I thought of you when this vision got dropped into my spirit. You came right along with it. And we've had fabulous guest hosts in the past, but I cannot think of anyone else to hold this season with me. You inspire me. You are one of just a few people that I know that have the capacity to simultaneously hold the hard things and our humanity. And that's an area I want to grow in. And I think it is a gifting, and an anointing really on your life that is so integral to living into the principles of deep democracy. We got to know each other more deeply as part of a design team for an unarmed response program in our community that we stood up. It's called Care-Based Safety Washtenaw. Um, and again, kind of working around how do we establish something that's so needed and so important and hold that many people are coming to the idea of not relying on police for safety with many nuanced experiences and perspectives. And so that was kind of like my first up close view of who you are. And then you participated in News Racial Justice Fellowship Champions for Change. And I would drop in on occasion, and just how you were showing up in that space affirmed what I had gotten to know in CBS. Um, and you've been a guest on Centering Justice. So you got all the receipts to be here this season. Now, y'all, Ryan, who uses he, him pronouns, is an educator, an artivist, which is to say he's both an artist and an activist. And if you're not following this Black man's birding, extraordinary birding and photography, you ought to be. And he's a cultural organizer. I mentioned an alum of Champions for Change, and Ryan builds beloved community and weaves advocacy for a number of social justice issues in pursuit of co-liberation, diversity in the outdoors, and environmental justice through that beautiful wildlife photography. You also are a member of Avalon Housing's board, advocating for housing justice, also mental health through your work with care-based safety and many other efforts. And I can attest that you are driven by compassion and curiosity, and always looking to expand our imaginations of what's possible. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you. I don't know if it's possible to have a more warm introduction. So, thank you. I know that for me, this topic, when you brought it up as a possibility, was one that really struck me as vital to how we move forward through this particular season, but also afterwards. Um, I have found myself getting frequently frustrated with a sort of tunnel vision on a single problem and a single outcome, and then people are ready to disconnect. And I've really enjoyed working with new through a lot of different avenues in the ways that the organization supports nonprofits who are really doing the work to hold a lot of our community together in a number of different ways. So I couldn't be happier or prouder to be part of this, and I'm really excited for us to all learn together as we take this deep dive into deep democracy.
Fantastic. And so this month's episode, which will kick off the season, is what is deep democracy? What are we talking about? We want to lay the framework for this topic and for the season. And the question that we're asking is, and I'm drawing this really from something you said, how can we witness for one another's truths, even when we don't always agree? And Ryan, let me say that again. How can we witness for one another's truths, even when we don't always agree? There is a lot happening in our community. Locally, we're just off of primary elections and all of what is coming from that. There's so much happening in our sector, a lot of which I mentioned in the opening. I did not mention contractions in funding. Almost every organization that we've worked with is seeing declines in funding broadly, but specifically declines in funding around racial equity and justice. And of course, there's so much happening in our country and so much in the geopolitical sphere that is also impacting our movements. At the core of deep democracy is the principle of awareness. So I want to begin, Ryan, with a question for you. What's pulling at your awareness right now?
No, I think that the awareness focus is one of the big strengths of this. I think because it acknowledges that we're not living in a academic thought experiment. We exist in a world that is messy and full of all sorts of things happening, and it doesn't stop for us while we try to figure it out. Um, Unfortunately, I think what's been drawing my attention in the past week or so has been um, some of the essentially racist remarks and things about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. Understanding that our nation has a really long history of scapegoating immigrants and finding a deep irony in Haitians in particular being the ones targeted for this, considering the phenomenal history and the incredible costs of for their freedom incurred by Western powers. Haiti paying reparations to France for freeing themselves for decades, and understanding how all those things come together. I live on the internet in some form or fashion in a number of ways, social media and online spaces, and I had a really tough time watching a lot of the memes and jokes fly because I know a little too much about how memes and jokes and things help influence people's subconscious opinions as well as their conscious ones.
Yeah.
And so I've been holding both the um, extremely black cultural value of we'll find a way to laugh at anything in order to survive
Yeah.
because laughter and joy is a way to provide resilience while not wanting to contribute to anything that helps towards the cause of dehumanizing our brothers and sisters, and understanding that these things are all happening in real time, and it's hard to watch those things go and say like, okay, well, hold up, what am I going to do about this issue? What am I doing in terms of my own advocacy or activism to help populations like this or this population in particular? Because that's how I like to start my own sense of deep democracy is to start understanding where I live in relation to what's going on,
Mhm.
how I either contribute to it or how I'm responsible for it,
Yeah.
and then what I'm trying to do about it.
Yeah.
So, Yodi, what about you?
Thank you for naming that, Ryan. It hits home for me. I have two nephews who were adopted from Haiti following the horrendous earthquakes there. And that those so I think it's more than even broadly an immigrant issue, it's a human issue, but they were displaced from their homeland because of the divestment or lack of resources that Haiti has had to be able to respond when horrific climate incidences like that occur. And so, yeah, to hear Haitian immigrants dehumanized in that way from someone who also wants to be the leader of the free world, and to hear so many followers of that person propagate anti-Black sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment is definitely top of mind. So thanks for naming that. You know, you mentioned being on social media all the time, and I usually am too, but lately it's been painful to be on social media, to see people who I love, who I have shared visions, beliefs, hopes, aspirations for, be targeting one another, and in many ways to be, I think, unconsciously perpetuating the white supremacist tenet of binary thinking. And it's painful because I know that these are people who feel passionate about liberation, about justice, about work in our sector. And yet there seems to be this shrinking, if you will, like a closing in that I feel, and a closing of ranks that really worries me. And I know that my phone is listening to me. And I know this because I've been talking about this with friends. And then this video pops up on one of my feeds of Roxane Gay, the US cultural critic and author, that brought some language to what I've been feeling and have been struggling to articulate, right? And I feel myself, and I think this will make sense in a moment, I feel myself succumbing to the fear of open conflict, right? So I'm like, I'm over analyzing what I post, what I share, who I, like what I like, what have you, because there is a lot coming at us and it is hard to parse that out. So Jess, would you tee up this short video, y'all, of Roxane Gay, who's the keynote at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas? Let's take a listen together, y'all. Uh-oh, we having some tech issues, Jess?
Are you not able to see it or hear it?
No.
Oh, okay. Let's try. Let me try again. Sorry about that, everybody.
All good.
We are in an age of inelasticity. And the danger of inelasticity is that we are becoming unyielding. And if we're not careful, we are all bound to break, and the world is going to break right along with us. What's worse is that this inelasticity exists not only across divisions, but within communities of like-minded people. Either we are entirely aligned or we have nothing in common. Either we offer unwavering allegiance to our ideologies or we are traitors. It's all very discouraging because progress is not made through a refusal to bend or listen or compromise. Not only are we inelastic, there is a shocking abundance of ideological impermanence. If you don't personally see someone on social media, for example, speaking on a given issue, then you decide that that person is silent and shirking their responsibility to speak up. Or worse, if you don't account for every person's reality when speaking on a given issue, you might as well say nothing at all. This can all be quite exhausting, and this inelasticity and impermanence are more silencing than any other discursive forces at work right now.
It just like hit me, right? Like this idea of inelasticity is from like sort of hit on that shrinking space for what I would call generative conflict, and for us to hold the truths, multiple people's truths.
Yeah, I think that I really want to just zero in on that idea of generative conflict. And I think that, when you hear people talk about issues of this, I mean, sometimes you've heard discussions about, some people get canceled too easily, or these things there. And I don't think that that's really what we're like aiming around as, like someone did something bad and we're gonna, hold them to account for it. That's not this. What we're talking about is when we're expecting and holding everyone to an invisible, unstated, impossible standard for understanding what's going on in the world around us. There's not really room for people to learn or catch up or move opinions. I think that it's something that is really prevalent, especially in spaces with people who are doing vital work, because frankly, everything feels urgent. It is hard to say, I want to maintain some space to acknowledge that I don't know everything when people's lives are on the line, and when we're watching very big things happen on a constant basis. Um, for myself, because I personally identify as an abolitionist, someone who is seeking to find ways to remove the carceral from community wherever I can. One of the reasons why I identify that way is that it's one of the personal ideologies that made open space for me to say, you won't have all the answers. You might not have, very many of them. You're going to need a million experiments, in the words of Miriam Kaba, to find a way forward that's going to work for you and your community. And it's freeing to know that you don't have to serve as a perfect, a perfect monolith of exceptional morality. Understanding that we have space to experiment and learn and grow, I think, is necessary for us to actually have any kind of functional democracy, lowercase d, as well as uppercase d. And our current system really doesn't have much space for that.
Spot on, spot on. You can almost see it playing out. There's the right way or the right move or the right, and there's very little room. And I think this has particularly been the case in the last year with folks' stance on Israel or Palestine, or folks' stance on whether you're Democrat or Republican, or or the interconnections of that. But even at the micro level, inside of our organizations, what is there, we need more expanse in conversations about how are we in relationship with philanthropy? How are we in relationship with a sector that is itself rooted in racism and other forms of class oppression, right? We need space to unpack with people on the many sides of this paradigm, to learn, as you say, what we may not know, and also to be able to say I don't know, as you know. And that's why that for me, sort of this big idea that democracy, which is kind of the arc and the theme of this season, is that democracy as we think of it isn't working. And for the last couple of years, because a lot of our work at New is in helping organizations think about their culture, what is the organizational culture? And we root that in what are the beliefs, the core values that guide your organization. And because we've been so laser focused on that work, I think it's brought to my awareness how in this country, so in big D democracy, how we have these espoused values of freedom, of liberty, of justice, and yet they are not accessible to everyone in our country, and they are not. We often see conflicting practices, right? We say that, and then we see conflicting practices, and so my assertion is that that ethos that lives in our country and in the fabric of this nation, whose original sins were occupying and colonizing land and kidnapping and trafficking bodies to construct a country, a nation, an empire, and an economic system, that those roots then and those practices have then bled into every institution in this country, so that when we talk about democracy, we're not just talking about a political system. We are talking about an apparatus that is used and leveraged in everywhere, including in our sector. And so this idea that democracy as we think of it isn't working is rooted in the what I want to propose, which is that deep democracy, which was first coined, by the way, by a psychotherapist and physicist, Arnold Mindell. And he talks about the idea that awareness is needed to bring democracy's most cherished beliefs and ideals to life. And in my world, some would say that nonprofits are the ultimate practice of democracy, right? That you have a group of folks that see an issue in their community, that mobilize and organize to try to address that. They pull their people resources, their time resources, their money resources together to form an organization that has a board that uses principles like majority voting and democracy to govern itself. And lots of those same organizations will acknowledge, and myself included, that our sector is fraught with issues, and that the organizational norms and practices often prop up the status quo and the vestiges of white supremacy. And so with deep democracy, we can acknowledge that power without awareness, right, which is what we interact with a lot in our sector, won't solve our interactional problems. And Mindell says that deep democracy teaches us that all people, all views, and if you feel some consternation here, that's okay. And all of the feelings are needed to come up with durable solutions. That's the deep part of democracy. So Ryan, we hear a lot about democracy in the traditional sense. How do you think deep democracy and what you know of it challenges our current understanding of those democratic systems? Why is it relevant today?
I definitely think that it's relevant and relevant today specifically because of what I've experienced working in our local nonprofit space, what I've identified in some of the more national, broader nonprofits, is both an aware, like somewhat of awareness of the limits of what people like to call like their locus of control. There's only so many things that they can control and focus on, and so I mean nonprofits, hone in on the things that they can control, and everything that has too many other factors is considered out of scope. Um, but we don't really live in a world that provides for the ability for each of us as individuals to be out of scope of things that are going on. Um, and I think that it's a continuous issue that comes through, not just for um, for our organizations, but also in our local governance. I find that there's a lot of consternation and anger around um, just how everyday life is managed and gets done. And when you dig into how people are feeling about it or what they're saying about it, you find that there's often a lack of understanding or even awareness of who is actually responsible for a particular problem, of whether they're talking at the right people to accomplish something. We have people who are in elected positions, who have sometimes think that they are not the people who should be solving problems. Um, and if our main system of representative democracy is one in which we elect people to go and then do things that we support, the way that we interact with them in order to let them know what we want as a collective we is something that has a ton of different issues baked in. Um, Community engagement, quote unquote, is something that a lot of municipalities, governments, organizations, companies spend a lot of money on. Sometimes a lot of money for consultants to tell them the things that they want to already hear. But there's often just
community engagement as an insurance policy.
yes, because community engagement says that if our decision was unpopular, hey, we asked people and they said they agreed with us, and there's never any actual accounting. There's very often not accounting for who makes up that community and whether it involves all voices. I think that one of the things that's powerful about deep democracy is the idea of bringing some of those marginalized voices to the center and thinking about, okay, how are we reacting to this? Because this, stated desire or stated need, even if it isn't something that is, recognized by the majority as relevant to their own lives, I hold the radical belief that we don't have to only care about things that affect ourselves. And I think that when you start actually putting that into practice, um, it shows up in a lot of really different, interesting ways. I think that we have a whole lot of examples from other systems, other political systems, other movements. You can look through, writings from decolonial writings about colonialism and Pan Africanism, and looking at ways that people were finding solidarity beyond borders, and being able to connect beyond the academy, for academics like W.B. Du Bois or Walter Rodney talking about how they really dove into those things. And you've got folks like Detroit's own Grace Lee Boggs, who often talked about the necessity of building relationships as the foundation for moving forward. There's a quote of hers, and I'm sorry I can't remember which book it's from. Might be from the Next American Revolution. But it's you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it. Um, in our current setup of traditional, or of the focus on electoral politics as our demonstration of democracy is one in which we advocate a lot of responsibility. We ask our representatives to carry forth what we want done, but we're not always in the room to tell them about what's happening. There's so many things that have been massively improved, and people have commented about, oh, you've really helped us, understand what we need to do here. And all I really did was show up, because the system is set up to overemphasize on those who have the time and economic ability, and physical capability to show up to a public hearing. Those voices get over indexed in terms of how we make decisions.
Can I say something about that? Because
Yeah.
I think there's some ways in which we can change our practices and behaviors. And I'm gonna tell a quick story, which is when I first one of the first things I worked on when I got to New was trying to democratize and diversify nonprofit boards, right? And and I was excited about that. You know, I myself was a young professional. I'd never served on a nonprofit board. And as I was learning and about it here at New, I was like, oh yeah, like, I know we need to get folks on. And then I got on a board. And I got on a board, Ryan, that met in the evening at a time that overlapped, dinner at a time that
Mm.
overlapped when my kids' childcare closed, right? They had an expectation of a certain giving level that was a little outside of my means. And it was really hard for me to understand coming into that group what the dynamics were and how I could show up. And so it took months for me to feel like I could, really assert myself in that space. And I
Yeah.
brought that awareness back to our work here, um, because in terms of guiding organizations that we work with, whether that's corporations or nonprofits or governments, to think about the design of how we want to engage people, the structural barriers to that engagement. And a couple other examples of that are like, who can be at a school board meeting at 11 o'clock at night
Right.
or a city council meeting, right? So what I see is people saying, well, we invited them and they didn't show up, but not materially changing the way we think about how do we get proximate to those voices. You really made me think about that. And I think we can make immediate changes. And in fact, that board did. It made it possible to join remotely. It provided stipends for childcare. It, met at a different time each month to allow for schedule changes. It didn't continue to perpetuate a meeting structure and style that benefited what essentially came down to middle-aged, privileged men who could come at that time
Yeah.
or meet at 9 o'clock in the morning. So thank you for that. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I love that example because it's a great example of what it means to democratize knowledge. You
Mm,
took the knowledge that you had in that room and said, here is what's needed to change this. But not only am I going to worry about it for this board, but we're going to build something for others to be able to plug into so that this knowledge is shared.
yeah.
Um, and we'll talk more about this, I think, later in the season,
Mhm.
especially in terms of building networks of connections of other people who are interested in building that better world with you. But I think that there's a strong assumption that when I talk about all these sometimes varied activities, that they all coalesce into one mixture for me. And that really does not make sense to a lot of people.
Mhm.
And what I told them is that I don't expect myself to be up to date on every bit of information, and I don't expect myself to know every issue. But I do hold myself accountable or responsible for knowing who in my community is going to have the knowledge that I need to improve something.
Yeah.
So I know that if I am dealing with a nonprofit, issue, and I'm having trouble figuring out the power dynamics, that I can text Jodit and say, "Hey, what's going on with this? Because this is
Mhm.
wild." Or being able to reach out to Comrade Ashley and go like, "Hey, we're dealing with things around harm reduction, and I know that you have deep knowledge in this space.
Mhm.
How do I both support what you're doing now and uplift and elevate that?" Because I think that the idea that you have to be as a single person um, an exemplar,
Right.
the shiny beacon on a hill all the time is a dangerous one. I think it's one that
Yes.
leads us to our own egos rather than building something that is community centered as we think about it. And the whole point of democracy is being able to make decisions together and live with them. Um, and I think that that's one of the strengths of deep
Mhm.
democracy is that it encourages us to build relationships, to know who can help us with various things,
Yeah.
um, and actually putting that into practice.
Yeah, I'm thinking again about like perfectionism, right? Um, people have really weaponized this idea of woke, but the roots of it in the Black Power movement are about awakening and about understanding the complex and necessary uh, forces within the movement, and also keeping ourselves alert and awake to that. Um, Before we move on, there was your spark. You got so many ideas sparking for me. I that we have to name the role of media in the urgency and the kind of swivel neck of how information and knowledge, as you describe it, is how we're interacting with it. And I see a tendency towards, which I believe is rooted in this idea of perfectionism, right? Like, I want to be on the right side. And so people are sharing and resharing and joining movements lacking really analysis, deep analysis. A great example of this is uh, the long and deep history of the Middle East, the history of how Israel comes to be, the history of how land and Western influence, right, impacts how borders are constructed and created. I want to just tell you a quick story. While I was on sabbatical, my son and I visited Rwanda. And a lot of us know about the 1994 genocide that occurred in 1994. Over a period of 100 days. 1 million people were unalived in this civil war. And I was aware of that. I was just out of high school when it happened. No one was really paying attention. And then, lucky for us, activists, organizers, and outlier media groups kind of brought it to our awareness. And much like the famine in Ethiopia that it was happening, greater awareness was raised. So it's only when I'm in Rwanda that I learn that Hutu and Tutsi were class identifications, not ethnic identifications, that actually those people descend from the same region and always have, and that it was France and the Catholic Church that used a systematic method to divide those people and to define those titles as ethnicities, that was the tool used to then pit them against one another. And in a future episode, we'll talk more about the kind of case study around Rwanda's return. It's now the cleanest and safest country on the continent, but there's a lot there to unpack about um, um, kind of our not following groupthink, but really digging, more deeply. And I think the urgency of what's happening, the crisis, the concern for people and safety, and my God, 40,000 people unalived, I get it. And too often, I think we're not slowing down to really understand and bring awareness to the complexity of it. And that contributes to our inability to say, oh, damn, I didn't know that. And now I understand deeply, and better, and I can shift. I, I don't know about you, but I feel myself being transformed in this topic of deep democracy. Um, and a question that we ask every guest that I want you and I to think about on centering justice is, when did you know you were being transformed or transforming which is to say, like starting to work in a different way or to move in a different way than you had previously. Can you answer that question, Ryan? Um,
I can, and I think the first thought in my head is a profound sense of gratitude because there's more than one answer. And just to have a reflective moment in front of everybody, I'm very proud of myself that there are multiple places that I can look at where my North Star didn't change in terms of what I cared about, but how I approached it changed. One area that I think about as being really um, there was a really transformative thing for me was um, reading back through the work of James Baldwin. This would have been his 100th birthday this past August. So you're getting my most recent transformative thought, which is, he has a quote from one of his novels saying that the children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. Um, and thinking about what that really means and what does it mean to,
just say that again.
yes, the children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And what does that mean in terms of how we live our lives in going through the both the hard things and finding room to make comfort for ourselves as we are trying to hold these heavy things. I know that I'm someone who doesn't have children, but cares deeply about children. And it was a quote that resonated for me deeply in understanding um, the urgency around love for these children and what it means to put that care into them and for them
Yeah.
into the world. My environmental work, I think about those children as the inheritors of a lot of those efforts, and knowing that you know, even small decisions around things, I know that they are not going to, drop the global temperature by zero point 0.1 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
But I need to be honest with myself about the ways in which I am contributing to harm for that environment for those children and ways in which I am doing my best to mitigate it.
Mhm.
I'm acknowledging that, like, there are places where, I produce a ridiculous amount of plastic waste compared to many other people, in part because I'm disabled. And so the medications I have to show up in a big old styrofoam crate that does not biodegrade and does not break down. And I'm aware that I'm adding to this. And I can make small decisions like choosing to buy a refurbished laptop and fixing it up myself to save for e-waste. But am
Yeah.
not holding myself to be perfect. But I am holding myself to be aware and to be responsible. And I know that it's very difficult sometimes to have the knowledge of all the things going on in the world, and still have to move every day.
Yeah.
I was reading a piece of fiction the other day that I felt like gave a really great um, answer to at least a descriptor of how I've thought about the way I move through my life. It's this a Psalm for the Wild built by Becky Chambers. It's I guess they call it like a hope punk book, like instead of a steampunk book. Um, Far future where humanity has its needs met is the baseline. Um,
Mhm.
and the character was talking about how when faced with the important tasks and the need to comfort yourself, find the strength to do both, because the finding the strength to give yourself comfort gives you resilience and restores you and allows you to do the difficult tasks.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important to look at, as I think about that Baldwin quote, and I think about what it means to think about all these world's children, to go, oh yes, I know what I'm doing in order to help improve these things. I know, when I'm working with this community center, that even if, they're not going to be running around my home afterwards, that I am contributing to our greater whole, and that it makes life for our entire community better. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be something that I have to see. And being able to hold those truths of, like, there are people who have really desperate childcare needs that are not being met in our system. It's
Mhm.
extremely expensive It's extremely difficult to obtain. It restricts people's economic mobility because it means you can't take certain jobs and things. Um, Knowing that and being aware of it means advocating for folks who can't be at those meetings, who can't show up to those spaces, and saying, friend, I will, take this up with you. I will walk alongside you in this. In the
Mhm.
same way that others, will carry my name in the rooms talking about disability justice. And that's something that we can do for each other. It builds upon each other. And if we really take it to account, it gives us space to imagine a world in which we are providing for each other, in a real way beyond what our nominal capacities are, because we're not counting on pure survival. We're not counting on, um, only focusing on our areas of expertise or strength, but we're
Mhm.
building broader resilience and abundance.
Yes. Mm. That was a word. I uh I think that there's at least one moment I can think where my thinking about needing to move differently, and that builds on what you said about all of the world's children being our own, is I can remember sitting, it was the day that Breonna Taylor's murderers were exonerated. And I happened to be, when the announcement came through from the AG, I was facilitating, uh, you know, training on unconscious bias. It was a majority
Mm.
white group that I had been holding space with, and probably like the 60th training of that kind I'd done. And I got off, I got the news, I felt it like a kick in the stomach. And a friend called and asked me how I was doing. And I just kind of like came undone. And I, after we got off the phone and I was sort of getting myself back together, I was reminded of the indigenous principle of 7 generations, 7 back and 7 forward, right? And I think it was humbling to check myself, Ryan, that I may not see what my work, right? And what I'm doing and what I've been called to do, I may never see the fruits of. But if I stop, right, because these people on this Zoom aren't going to do what I'm telling them to do today, right? Then what are the reverberations of that for many generations to come? It was a turning point for me. And it was also an ugly point of having to die to my ego a little bit, right? That to untether myself from the outcomes and to think about how am I contributing to that long arc, right? Or that 7 generation principle. And maybe where I'm still I saw something. I don't know if you did watch the debate, or at least you heard about it.
Yes.
And there's a point in the debate where the moderators ask VP Harris about fracking and some other
I know where
things.
you're going. Yep.
You remember that? And it's happened twice. It happened when she was interviewed by CNN. And both times she said two things. One, she's like, my values haven't changed, but I'm not going to ban fracking. And we know that when she was running for president, that she did say she wanted to put an end to fracking. And so I watched and I wondered, why can't she just say, I learned something, I became more aware, or my thoughts on this thing changed? Like, why can she not say that and be able to evolve, like have evolved her thinking? And I actually posted about it in an ad. Like, I was like, why is this? And of course, folks were like, because the media will take those talking points and abuse her, and it'll, and weaponize them, and it'll affect the election. And other folks said, because donors and the like. But I'm, what I'm holding for this season is, what are the ways in which, in those moments where the consequences are great, we will slow down and we will acknowledge that something has changed, right? And that we are not um, bad or unelectable or a terrible leader or whatever stories we tell ourselves when we acknowledge that that's been the case. And then just one final thing that's on my heart is that I think is such a glowing example. I mentioned the 40,000 folks unalived in Palestine. To be clear, there is never a moment where the death of of Israeli people's children is in any way acceptable to me, right? And yet, I don't find as much generosity for that in some of in some of how we're talking about these things. And I would love, Ryan, just to get into the uncomfortable stuff of conflict. How could how does deep democracy view conflict, and why is growing in our capacity to hold that kind of generative conflict of like the one I mentioned, um, so essential to our progress?
I think that it's worth just thinking about the ways in which um, debate and argument are positioned in our society right now. Um, Frankly, there are a number of people who consider, issues and debating a game. They don't have a stake in the in the outcome, and so it's about who can make those talking points, who can win the headline battle, um, and how we can move forward from there.
Do
And
you
you know,
remember when debates were boring and no one watched them?
I miss it. I miss it a lot. Um, because
Now it's like
I
watching a
was still a little
reality
nerd
TV
watching
show.
those when I was a kid, even when they were boring. Um, because and the reason that they were interesting to watch is because you were hoping to understand more about how a person makes decisions and what makes them think. And that's not really how we're set up to work in this current media environment. But people, I think, extrapolate from what they've seen in these spaces and are applying that to their everyday lives. I've seen people in my tiny town, in my town of 5,000 people, outside of Ann Arbor, say, well, what, well, I'm never going to apologize for a thing because that's what's being politically modeled for them, um, and the idea that we can't find ways to apologize for what is wrong, that we have to always be right, that our records have to be spots that there's no room for forgiveness is one that, as an abolitionist, is easy for me to dismiss, because I've committed to a value of no one being disposable. And if no one's disposable, that means that I'm not willing to completely throw someone out, even if their opinions are terrible, or even if they've you know come up to what I consider a really bad decision. It doesn't mean that I choose to work with everyone. And it doesn't mean that I, have like force myself into certain situations. But when there's base agreement over our shared humanity with people, and I know that we have some core common denominator beliefs around respect for each other and the ability to discuss these things, then conflict can be really generative. Um, there were times in a lot of the work around building that unarmed response program, that the group had conflicts with each other, about that stemmed from some closely held beliefs about what was the best way forward for what people need for safety. And some of those are, held from personal experiences that are, you know, really powerful, but not always data. Sometimes people had public health data and said, like, the best practices, a phrase that I'm very guilty of using a lot. The best practices say that the answer should be A, B, and C. But when we talk to all the other nonprofits and our safety net, no one could support it in that way. And so we had to come back and think about, okay, well, if at the conjunction of our desires and our ideals, you know, we're still finding conflict. So we have to make a container for it. We have to make space to hold that conflict, and to be able to do so in a way that both honors our own ways of knowing, and makes room for us to speak with each other, to highlight the things that are there. And one of the ways that we changed how we approach through conflict was changing how we made and finalized decisions. It was moving away from majority rule for some of our internal discussions and saying, instead, we're going to move towards a consent-based model where we're asking someone if they have an objection to it, and lifting that up and seeing if that spreads. There are plenty of times where, the seemingly obvious track, the politically expedient thing to do, is what we would have done without that system. We would have just said, you know what, we'll go with the city process because that's the one that's most likely to get us this funding. And it took people saying, I don't want to be held by that. I want to be able to do what's best in our own minds, and I want us to still have community control over this. It was a big conflict point. People have relationships with the city. They wanted to um, they wanted to leverage those and continue them. People didn't want to cause hurt feelings. People understand that, people have long memories and they'll hold decisions against you. If you change your mind, like on fracking, someone will come back and use it as an attack ad for you in the future. And so, what does it mean to build a space where you can have a conflict that legitimately changes people's minds, or at least prepares you for a world in which you can live with that other opinion, um, without it having the kind of dire consequences that stifle any kind of dissent or discussion.
Mhm.
Um, one other thing that I want to add
There's
here is that,
mutuality too.
go ahead.
I want to stick with that consent piece for
Yeah,
a
yeah,
moment. So shifting from the majority, where then the minority in that is grumbling or feels like they lost, right, or their voices weren't heard, to a way of being that not only can you object, right, in consent-based voting, but you are asked in the spirit of mutuality to offer a counter proposal, which causes you to have to think about and think through what is that objection? How do you, starting from a place of what was proposed, right? How can you then say, here's how it's a mindset shift. Here's how I think we could make it better. Because that's the other thing I think happens in this debate sort of dynamic, is that there's a right and a wrong. There's a side to be on, and there's
right,
no room for nuance or for complexity or for iteration, right? And so our choice to move from that kind of a decision-making model towards something that really pauses and stops and asks each person, do you have consent for this way forward? Um, um, Cynics might say it slows things down. Same with community engagement, right? Like if we actually went and listened to the folks most impacted, it's going to cost more. It's going to take more time. We don't have it in the budget. We yada, yada, yada. But conversely, we run the risk of building something that doesn't actually work towards that long-term change and transformation we're after, right? And similarly, in the model of CBS that you're talking about, we got to really sit with and interrogate those diverse views and perspectives, all of which wanted the same thing
right.
ultimately, right? An unarmed response program. Excellent point.
No, yeah, I think that there's something really beautiful about that because um, you mentioned near the top of the episode about the the things that kind of suffuse into our space from our structure. Um, some of them are that because our presidential elections, our municipal elections are first past the post, that there's a winner and loser, that there is things are zero sum, and so many parts of our lives are not zero sum.
Yeah.
And I think that approaching every problem as if it is mediated by that same kind of system just brings a lot of bitterness.
I mean, but
Because
also, like, if you tell me, if the argument of, well, if you don't vote for this person, then you're voting for fascism. We're already in fascism. Like the ideals of fascism are rooted in racism, also oppression, and really fascism in our minds, right? Authoritarianism in our minds. And it doesn't leave room for what else besides the system we're currently in is possible, right?
right.
We can't even
And so much
conceive
of what
of a multi-party system because
right.
if we do that, then we're going to cause someone else to lose, kind of thing, and we end up perpetuating the status quo.
And I think that there's so much that's, in terms of how we interact with systems, I think that there's like a long history of strategically engaging with them and saying you don't have to agree with it, but you should understand it.
Mhm.
Is my personal stance towards a lot of these things, and where I know, I made my decisions about how to engage with those systems based off of um, those who I feel are most vulnerable. And in making that shift and knowing sometimes that aligns with my own positionality.
Mhm.
And those are times when I let my voice take the center. And there's other times where it doesn't, and I ask other people to move in that gap, where I try to make room for those voices. There is no there's a another quote that I am super fond of by the writer Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer. She says that like we live in capitalism. Um, that but in that I'm trying to think of what the full quote is. Sorry, we live in capitalism. Its might seems inescapable. So too did the divine right of kings. And that any human power can be changed um, by human beings. Um, in her case, she was talking specifically about the power of words and of art, and it's something that I think I've tried to take into my art. But when I talk about the need to expand imagination, it's that um, I don't really consider myself an idealist, and I know that some people think of me that way. I think that there's a real practicality to figuring out what it means to take responsibility for being a neighbor, and for expanding that definition of neighbors broadly. It means for me participating in that electoral system, but also knowing that afterwards I still have a lot of work to do. I'm going to have a lot of work to do no matter who is in charge of American hegemony. I'm going to have different work to do. So I'm choosing my battle. I'm choosing my place of my place of battle. Um, and thinking about how I relate to other people and those relationships, voting is a relationship. And asking people to, represent you for a thing requires some sort of back and forth. And where traditional democracy is broken is that many of us don't have, or don't feel like we have, a relationship where that is acknowledged or understood by the people who hold the nominal power in our system. But
Mhm.
outside of those, in our, the decisions that get made about, um, what's like, about what's going to be parkland and what will be housing, about who's able to afford these things here. There's all sorts of smaller decisions about bus routes, about bike lanes, um,
Yes.
everything from how we fund after school football and basketball that have impacts on equity in people's everyday lives. And I would invite people, as they're thinking about both their political activity, um, to not restrict it to strictly the electoral. That there is, quote unquote, political activity that is happening in the Facebook group of moms discussing, which teacher they're going to try to get their kid in for English this year, because that itself is a use of communal power and sharing of resources and knowledge, and one that's not always equal and has spaces for inequities to come through.
Yeah.
There are places to make change and to actually make progress. You can see these things, that are building blocks for the world we're trying to build. Um, Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that the first thing, the thing you need to change in order for abolition is to change everything. And it's a really terrifying thought when you're starting off, but I find it incredibly freeing, because it means that everything is worth re-examining, everything is worth investigating, and everything's worth fighting for. So, that same with that divine right of kings. I know that police were invented. So
Mm.
I'm looking to find ways to work
Mhm.
towards their gentle disassembly um, into a community space that gives us what we need.
Yeah.
That I am talking about changing something that humans created with human hands. And I think it's important to keep that at the center of our thoughts for it.
Absolutely. I had an experience. So I think I alluded to being in East Africa on my sabbatical. And one of the places that I visited was the city of Aksum. It's a sacred and ancient city in the northern part of Ethiopia. And we went to the site of Queen Sheba's palace. Queen Sheba is said to have, uh, well, did marry Solomon, has really, and had this palace here in Aksum. And the palace is maybe a mile from the oldest church in Ethiopia. And a struggle that I've been having, and I had it when I was in Ethiopia a decade ago, is why do I see images of white deities, white Jesus, white God, whatever? And so I finally got the courage up while we were on this uh, guided tour through Shiva's space to ask this of the guide, like, why do I see, images, religious images in an African country that are white? And the reason why I asked it is because the land that we were on and the remains of of Shiva's palace were all there centuries before the establishment of Christianity, right? So I have this cognitive dissonance, and I want to understand. And I'm getting to somewhere here. So I said to him, "Why is that?" And he looked at me a bit perplexed. And he said, "You need to understand, which you likely don't because of your orientation in the West, that at that time, there was no construction of race. So that there were people of different, differently melanated that were moving across these lands, folks from that we would conceive of as Arab, and folks that were Judaic and Aramaic and African and the like, right?" And man, Ryan, all these years I've been doing this work, and his words and his earnest way of responding, which was to say, you are operating within the lens of constructed identities that have formed and shaped every idea you have. So to your point about being willing to let some stuff go or to expand our thoughts. And I had already been toying with this idea. I didn't feel comfortable like saying it out loud, but this idea of like, what I really want is the end of race as we know it. I don't want to order and other people based on identities that are inherently oppressive, right? Inherently designed to harm some and benefit others. And having that conversation and that dialogue with him sort of fortified for me that it's okay to dream that we are all free of those, and that we begin to see one another as fully human, and the ways in which a system that was created was done so to distance and separate us from each other, right? To disconnect us from ourselves, to disconnect us from land, to disconnect us from our in groups and our out groups. It was a really powerful moment, and I appreciate you sort of saying how the practice of deep democracy in our everyday life of asking ourselves and interrogating, examining ourselves for those beliefs that we've held on to can be really powerful. Good stuff. Good stuff.
Really good stuff.
So this is the time in the chat's been blowing up, but I've been like so intrigued.
Keep it focused.
Yes, and hyper focused. So I want to get into that, but we always want to be engaging with our live audience and our listeners afterwards. And so for those of you who are on today and maybe feeling motivated, what is the invitation that you're feeling called to? What's one way you might be able to think about living into these principles of deep democracy? So holding conflict, inclusivity, designing with margins at the center, and awareness. And you can drop it in chat while y'all are thinking about that. I actually put the question in the chat for those who appreciate being having a moment of reflection.
While you're typing that, something that um, came to mind as we're talking about what's like living deep democracy is that I think that we all inhabit a number of different identities. We talk about that often. I think about the communities that we inhabit that sometimes align with those identities or work across them. In the disability justice community, there's this uh, saying, or like the rallying cry of "nothing about us without us," which is something that I really have held on to, both because it took me a long time to come to my own acceptance of my identity as a disabled person.
Mhm,
The things that made me disabled have been there the whole time. But whether I was willing to call myself that, or to, whether I
mhm.
felt welcome or able to interact with those spaces, is something that changed over
Yeah.
time. And as my understanding and opinions and thoughts and um, self-actualization changed around those,
Mhm,
I began to recognize just how powerful of an idea that is, and to say, and to say like, oh yes, I'm going to not just make sure that I am able to participate in this thing that I wish to be part of, because I deserve to have a space in that future
yeah.
that we're trying to build. That the future we're going to build is accessible, and it needs to be for me to be able to participate in it fully. But
Mhm,
beyond that, understanding that disabilities are very wide and varied and personalized. Um, and what one person needs in terms of access might conflict with another person's need. Um,
mhm,
there is a broad history, and both big and small, of conflicting access needs, which are times where people's physical needs or their mental needs around spaces come into conflict, and that's generative conflict. It's figuring out how we can do best for the most people, be able to understand that those things going through. And it struck me just now that that's a wonderful example of deep democracy in action, because it's making space for that consent-based movement. It's making space for highlighting and bringing forth those factors, and knowing that, okay, well, everybody isn't going to be at every meeting, but we're going to make sure that the meetings are going to be possible. We're not going to be someplace that doesn't have a ramp for physical access for those who use chairs, that we're going to have online availability if possible, that people will wear masks so that folks who are immunocompromised feel safe showing up. Um,
mhm.
it's
Yeah.
it's really something.
You
Oh,
know,
there's some good
the
comments too.
masking thing is so good. I appreciate you mentioning that because, I have chosen to mostly be unmasked. I also have some underlying issues, but I have no problem and do proactively mask for folks that are in my network that I know need that support. And I don't want them to have to ask. And I don't want to be like, I don't have to. And it's not like it takes nothing from me to put that mask on to keep somebody else safe. Let me jump into, we're getting some comments in. One of our participants said, listening to others coming from a place of care. This is in response to the prompt, what's one way or many ways we could begin living out these principles. Expansiveness and a curious mind in the midst of conflict, which is so like we're going to talk about this more this season because it takes a lot. Like we got to get in our bodies to understand the way in which it signals us and either supports us or gets in the way of us being able to hold generative conflict. That I love that. Someone else noted that deep democracy sounds somewhat like the Quaker process, where it's the sense of the meeting that can take years to come to a place of articulation of something that all can identify with. Yeah, really good point there. And or to say with conscious what they stand aside. Love that. Um, also, just before I put the prompt in response to what you were talking about in terms of expanding the political beyond the electoral, this person is noting like, we have to understand that some people are not going to vote and be willing to accept that. And I do think there's a lot of like pressure and calling out and all of that around people's choices. But and this person encourages that we strive for ways to be politically involved beyond just one election. And I think that's what you were saying to us, like some practical things. How are we showing up to, meetings that might not directly impact us, but where we can bear witness for those who are impacted, be they, yeah, I think that's good.
An example of that from recently that I've been really excited about is that um, my town has needed a senior center for a very long time.
Mhm.
And in one of the final meetings, pushing through requests for funding and everything else, I looked around at the people who were there, and more than half of us were not seniors.
Mhm.
Talking about the need for not just a senior center, but also a need for intergenerational connection,
Yeah.
and how it's important for us to build bridges um, between generations so that we can continue talking to each other, so we can continue understanding each other, so we can learn
Mhm.
from each other because there's so much there. Um,
Yeah.
and that changed the calculus about whether we could, as a community, quote unquote, afford to do X, Y, or Z. Because now, when we thought about it as an intergenerational center, including our seniors, but also including our youth or programming for other community folks, then the possibilities expanded. And just by participating and being there and showing that care for a constituency outside of oneself, um, demonstrates to people that they need to change their assumptions about who cares about what happens in the community. The closer we get to a space where we're all really participating and understanding with each other, and not saying that we're going to have to know everything and be everything to everybody, but that we're going to know who to talk to or who to listen to in spaces around certain topics and get cues from there and then make up our minds or change our
Mhm.
minds. Is a much healthier place to be, in my opinion, than where we currently are, which is you put on your jersey and you take the talking points to the side that you're on, because that only, to torture this football metaphor. If if you're doing all those things, then you're you're not the person calling the plays. You don't necessarily have agency in the same way in choosing to surrender all of that critical thought. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that it's fully possible to create a lot of good while still um, choosing to abstain from some practices. Like, I'm someone who's going to vote in the fall. I have plenty of friends who are definitely going to be, on the fence or possibly not doing so. We've had discussions about, well, is that across the board? Is that around certain people? What
Right.
about these county judges? Because when folks go up for, you know, so someone gets sent to Child Protective Services, this is the person who would take care of their case. Do you want to have a say in
Right.
this, and really breaking it down so that we understand the decisions that we're
Yeah.
making? And I think that if we can be honest with ourselves about our choices and our responsibilities for them, it's a big difference than
Mhm.
shoving them under the rug and saying, well, that was someone else's choice. I'm not responsible for it. I don't hold anything to it. I'm going to benefit from all the pros that come from living in the American empire, but I'm not going to hold myself accountable for anything else.
Yeah.
And I think it's just healthier to be honest with ourselves about the choices that we're making and the costs that they incur.
Yeah. What was bubbling up for me is also like standing in the gap for those folks who are immobilized right now or choosing to step back, right? Um, and there's there's also I'm seeing a lot of folks burning out. So I just want to maybe bookend our conversation today with how each of us doing our part, participating, asking those questions, showing up at the senior facility, or standing in the gap for folks who, for whatever reason, are not, participating. Having those conversations are all practices of community care as well, and allow those whose time it is to be at the front, of the line, or the front of the marathon, to know that they're supported, that they can take a break, and that others are coming up the rear. So, ooh, I mm, I
You
knew
ready
we
for a
were-
whole season of this?
I'm I am. What I'm noticing in my body is how I feel when I've been in deep practice, where like I kind of need to allow some things to settle in. Ryan, you stimulate my thinking and my emotions in such like juicy and generative ways. So I'm excited, brother. We gonna get into it. We gonna get into it. What a juicy, juicy, juicy episode, Ryan. Thank you. Thank you. Just imagine if, you invited us to radical imagination, that imagine if we could fully realize deep democracy and what the world might look like. I want to encourage our listeners to take some time today or soon to think about or jot down what that vision could look like for you. There's real power in our energetic connections and in us daring to dream and to imagine a world where all of us is free. So it really is possible to create the world we need together. So I want you to be sure to stay plugged in. Jess, the amazing Jess, just dropped a link to the Eventbrite for those of you who want to come back and join us live. Also, if you're not already, follow New on YouTube, Nonprofit Enterprise at Work. We have a whole playlist that has all, I think we're coming up on our 49th episode, all of the episodes there to go back and listen to and share. And if you're enjoying what we're up to, this shit ain't free. So please consider making a donation. And this year, I'm really focused on also finding some media sponsors so that we can scale Centering Justice. So help us think about that too. And we use those dollars to compensate our guests, to caretake for our producers and our staff, and hopefully to continue to fuel our collective inspiration. We will catch you next month in October. And until then, let's keep building, let's keep loving, let's keep getting free together. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for folks who joined.
Eileen,
Yes.
hi.